Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. One of the symptoms of the deepening crisis of capitalism and imperialism is the continuous increase of inequality. Even in developed imperialist countries, even in Finland, which is often romanticized as a so-called social democratic welfare state, in reality the Finnish so-called welfare state was a concession that the workers were able to win from the capitalists in fierce class struggle, and also a concession that the imperialist capitalist ruling class gave in order to try and pacify the workers. The ruling class on the one hand needed to do this to survive because it was threatened by the growing communist movement. If they hadn't made any concessions, they would certainly have been overthrown. That is not to say that the communists couldn't overthrow capitalism even if the capitalists make compromises, but I'm just saying that the capitalists, they certainly needed to make some concessions, otherwise it was certain that they would lose. So that's why the ruling class needed to do it. And on the other hand, the ruling class was able to do it because Finland was becoming an imperialist country. It was starting to exploit and super exploit the working masses of oppressed third world countries. But all that being said, even in imperialist countries, the capitalist class no longer wants to and can no longer afford to try to bribe the masses with these little scraps that they give to the same extent as before. Instead, even in imperialist countries, they've implemented cuts to social spending and austerity measures, as well as given tax cuts to the rich, in order to try to boost the falling capitalist profits. This process has been going on since the 70s and 80s. There were some zigs and zags. There were some improvements to social welfare that were implemented in the 70s, but there were also some austerity measures already in the 70s and certainly in the 80s and especially the 90s. And it has continued, but it's gotten more rapid. The cuts and austerity have increased and intensified over the years. According to the Finnish state media, quote, Finland lowered its corporate tax rate from 24.5% to exactly 20% 10 years ago, unquote. Clearly this doesn't mean that Finland has the lowest corporate tax rate in the world, but it's going down. And they've announced that there will be further tax cuts. The government, quote, decided in the budget debate that ended on Wednesday that the corporate tax paid by companies will decrease from the current 20% to 18% in 2027. The goal is to increase economic growth and to encourage companies to invest, unquote. This has been criticized by experts, and it will actually cause severe social problems. Corporate tax revenues have already fallen by 1 billion from 8 to 7 billion, and already at this rate they will fall by almost another billion. Quote, due to the decrease in corporate tax income, the government will cut a corresponding amount from elsewhere in the state economy. For example, from social welfare and healthcare and municipal funds, unquote. The Finnish healthcare system has already been to a significant degree privatized in order to cut spending and provide new markets for capitalist corporations. The way it actually works is that there's a very underfunded public sector where if you're poor, you have to go to the public sector where the lines are extremely long because of lack of funds. And some municipalities cannot afford to provide healthcare at all, so they've fully privatized. In those cases, the government will pay all or at least part of the costs of the citizens who have to do private healthcare because there is no public option. And there is no rational argument for why that is a good system. It actually costs the government more. It costs the customers more. It's bad for everybody. It's also unconstitutional, or at least it used to be until the constitution was amended, because the constitution used to say that everybody is entitled to equal access to healthcare and equally good healthcare. But that is no longer the case. It hasn't been the case for a while. So there is no reasonable argument for why that should be done. Instead, it's been done only to give corporations new markets. Because healthcare used to not be a for-profit market. It was basically just a service provided by the government. But with privatizations, they've opened it up for profiteering. And the private sector is also completely parasitic of the public sector, because usually the private sector only treats fairly easily treatable illnesses. So for example, if your workplace has some kind of agreement with private healthcare so that it turns out you have an illness, you go to the private sector. If the healthcare of your workplace covers it, and oftentimes it will not, I've also been in that position where I've gone to the private sector healthcare because that's where my workplace tells me to go. I go there, they say, oh yeah, you have this, but if you want to have it properly checked out, you're going to have to fork over a bunch of money because they won't pay for it. And I'm like, oh, okay, damn it. Then I have to pay the money. Then they check it out and they say, okay, you need to get this treated, but we don't do it. Only the public sector does that. So they still send you the public sector. Now, I personally haven't had anything super serious, health-wise, but let's say you have to get like a surgery or something. I'm pretty sure only the public sector does that, public hospitals. The private sector usually just has these little clinics where they do dental stuff and blood tests, or they just look at you and say, okay, yeah, you got the flu or something. So to get back to the main point, the healthcare has already been privatized to a significant degree. It's been very centralized. You can live in some more rural area or in a small town where they only have private clinics because the municipality or the city is too poor to provide healthcare. The private clinic diagnoses you with something serious. They say, oh, we can't treat you. We have to send you hundreds and hundreds of kilometers away, sometimes to the capital, to be treated in the public sector like central hospital. That's the way it works right now. It's an unsustainable system. Clearly it's headed towards further privatizations, but they haven't figured out how to do it because it's, I think, difficult for the capitalists to replace public healthcare because they would rather only skim the cream off the top. They would treat the stuff that's easy to treat, doesn't require a lot of costs, but they still get a bunch of money from it. The government has also recently announced that the Finnish postal service will be listed to the stock exchange, and that private investors will be able to buy shares of the postal service, and that has been done. According to a communique published by the state, quote, listing Posti Group, or the postal service, shares could be a good way to support the postal service's competitiveness, unquote. I don't know how exactly this works in other countries, but Finland has a very well-developed model for privatization, this very sneaky, gradual way of privatization. First, the public services and utilities are just that. They're just services. The government just gives you that. They're funded with taxpayer money. The customer doesn't have to pay anything. Then they turn it into a company, into a corporation. The government still owns it, but it starts to function in a for-profit way. That's the way the railways have worked for a really long time, for example. The government owns it, or at least part of it, but it's still just a regular company that tries to be profitable. Then they make it into a stock company, they start selling the shares, but the government still retains the majority of the shares. And then they turn it into a stock company where the government only has a minority of shares, and then from there you can go to full privatization. This can happen very gradually over a long period of time. It's very sneaky, because otherwise there would be a huge public outcry. People would protest much more. And they do things like underfunding these services to make them worse. They boost the private alternatives to make them seem better, so that once the totally underfunded and crummy service finally gets fully privatized, the people don't care as much. This is a very long process of intense propaganda and basically brainwashing, just day in, day out, media stuff about how, oh yeah, the private is so good and the public is so bad, and we need to make the public sector more competitive like the private sector. The government has announced that it will retain ownership of at least 33% of the postal service. So this is a clear path towards privatization of even more of the basic, even the most basic public utilities like the postal service. And the arguments they make are just ridiculous. They say, oh, people don't buy as many newspapers anymore or something. But that doesn't make any sense because people actually order more packages than probably ever in history. Some of the packages are delivered by foreign megacorporations like DHL, some by British Royal Mail. But in Finland, I would say the vast majority of stuff you order from online is delivered by the postal service. Even if you buy stuff from abroad, the foreign monopolies have agreements with the postal service, so that in vast majority of cases it will be the postal service that delivers it to you. Or if DHL goes to your home and you're not there, they will just take to the post office and then you have to get it from the postal service. So it's not that people no longer need the postal service. No, it's the opposite. It's a huge market. They have dollar signs in their eyes. They see, oh man, if we could get our hands on that, if we could get the profits from all of that stuff, then that could really boost the capitalist profits. And that's exactly why they're doing it. But they're doing it in a very clever way, because now the private investors can directly invest into the postal service. There's kind of a funny anecdote years ago, the Postal Service actually changed its name to Itella to make it seem more, I don't know, marketable or something, because in foreign countries they don't know what Posti is. But there was huge public criticism of the name change, so they changed it back. So clearly they've been thinking about these kinds of things for a very long time already. At the same time, income inequality has increased tremendously, and it will certainly only become worse. The poorest 25% of Finnish citizens now own property that's worth less than 10,000 euros. That's all of their earthly possessions. The state media reports, quote, "The wealth gap between Finnish households has continued to grow in recent years, according to Statistics Finland." So that's the Statistics Bureau. In 2019, half of households had assets of over 104,000 euros, while the wealth of the wealthiest quarter was about 260,000 or more, which means it could even be millions or tens of millions. It's one of those sneaky statistical things they do. You say, okay, the wealthiest quarter, it starts from 260k up, which means that there's huge differences within that group. They continue, and the wealth of the poorest quarter was less than 9,400 euros, unquote. And again, it's 9,400 or less, which could mean you have zero. And in fact, with a lot of people, it is zero. But let's imagine you have 9,400. What can you buy with that? What do people like that own? Well, they clearly don't own a house. They clearly don't own an apartment. They probably have the cheapest furniture, cheapest appliances, like dishwashing machine, refrigerator, which those even can be quite expensive, oven, microwave, all of that costs money. Like even coffee makers, they're not necessarily cheap. Some cheap kitchenware, the cheapest clothes, either they don't have a car or they have to have a very cheap old used one. You can't get much of a car with that kind of money. They clearly don't own their own home, so they have to pay rent. Rents tend to be 500 euros per month at least, but it could be way more. Depends a lot where you live. So if your whole net worth is less than 10,000 euros, then you basically only have the necessities. I mean, then if you want to buy other stuff like a game console, like what does a PlayStation or Nintendo cost? Like 400, 500, 600? The games are like 60, 70, 80 euros a piece. You won't be able to afford that. And if they have children or family members to take care of, then they'll be seriously struggling. Food, even for one person, costs hundreds a month. Tank of gas costs around 100. And I think if you have a car, even though you have to maintain it and you have to pay taxes for your car and do all that stuff, I think having a car is still cheaper than using public transport. I could be wrong. Maybe people who live in certain areas, they might get like some kind of good deal if they use public transport like all the time. But at least like medium to long distance, public transport actually costs a lot. Definitely costs more than having your own car. And according to the state media, in 1988, quote, "The poorest half of the population's net wealth accounted for just over 10%, unquote. But since then, it has fallen to only 4%. So since the 80s, the wealth of the poorest 10% has been more than halved. And, quote, "In Finland, wealth is increasingly concentrated among the richest. Median net worth has fallen by about 20%. The wealthiest 10% owned 52% of all net wealth in Finland in 2023, while the poorest 10th had more debts than assets," unquote. So the richest 10%, they own half of everything, while the poorest 10%, they own nothing. They just have debt. And even the poorer 25%, they have very little. They either have next to nothing, only the essentials, or maybe they have a little bit more than that, but then they just have a lot of debts. According to the state media, quote, "The richest 10% now own more than half of household net wealth for the first time in the history of measurement," unquote. So the situation is clearly getting worse. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. And this has been going on for years, it's been going on for decades, but especially in recent years, it's gotten worse and this development has gotten faster. In Finland, quote, "Housing is the most important form of wealth. 3 out of 5 households have debt. And for every fourth indebted household, the amount of debt exceeded 75% of household assets," unquote. So most people have debt, and a quarter of those people who have debt, they have more debt than wealth. They're mostly just in debt. there's been a tremendous increase in consumer debts as well in recent years. And that's because consumer debt is a good way for capitalism to artificially increase purchasing power, because the problem is capitalism goes into a crisis of overproduction, which does not mean that people already have everything they no longer want for anything. No, everybody needs stuff. Like, there's people who don't have enough food, there's people who don't have adequate housing, they need fuel for their car, they need repairs for their car, there's stuff that they want. Would be nice to have new clothes, would be nice to have this and that, but they can't because they don't have the money. Purchasing power is too low, they cannot buy. So capitalism has a crisis of overproduction. There's all these goods that people would want, but they can't get them. So the capitalists can't get them sold. What is the solution? Sometimes the solution is for state to subsidize people's purchases, which is basically just a money transfer from the state, which is really taxpayer money from the people, to transfer that money to the capitalists. But if they don't do that, and sometimes they do that, but it's just not enough, so then on top of that, they do consumer debt. So you don't have the money to buy food or repairs for your car or whatever, but you need a car to go to work, so then you take debt. So the capitalist is able to sell it, you end up in debt, and it just builds towards this bubble where eventually people are so much in debt that there's no way they can pay it back. And when that happened in 2008, well, of course, the state bailed out the capitalists using money from the taxpayer. But of course, they can't do that indefinitely. Eventually, the state will also be in too much debt. I mean, all the states are already in debt. But those are the kinds of things that capitalists do. I mean, even now, the Finnish state, of course, is in debt. But what they're doing is they're cutting taxes on the rich, which makes them lose tax revenue. If the tax revenue used to be 8 billion, then it goes to 7 billion and to 6 billion. That is a big reduction. And also these cuts to healthcare, worth billions, they are significant cuts. But the government does it because it's an instrument of the capitalist class. And it's not only the right-wing government. Finland has a right-wing government now, nationalist, conservative, Christian government. But prior to that, we had a social democrat, green, left government. They also did the same. And before that, we had a center-right and nationalist coalition government. They did the same. So it doesn't significantly matter which one of these mainstream bourgeois parties are in power. They all do the same, and the people in the state machinery also remain mostly the same regardless of who is in the government. The people in the state apparatus are not elected. The capitalist class who runs everything, they remain the same regardless of who's in the government. They also, of course, don't get elected. So while all of this is going on, while the poor are getting poorer, services are being cut, in the meantime, not only are the capitalists, the very richest people who own all the companies, not only are they getting richer, but also the politicians who serve them are getting very rich indeed, and at least according to the latest trends, they're getting richer than in the past. Because the supposedly very leftist social democrat, our ex-prime minister, Marin, who apparently has been like trending in the US or something, she just released a biography. She's like not even 40 or something, but she released a biography. All the politicians have been releasing biographies lately. She earned $500,000 last year from salaries and about 10K from investments. Now, let me ask you, who gets a salary of almost $500,000? I certainly don't. In fact, I don't know anybody who comes anywhere close. To get a salary of even $100,000 a year, you would have to earn almost 10K a month, which is preposterous. I don't know anybody like that either. I don't know anybody who even approaches that. So to get $500,000 a year is crazy. It's not even from investments, it's a salary. What kind of job do you have where your contribution is so important that you earn that kind of salary? Think about what kind of an hourly wage that is. So according to the state media, quote, Marin currently works as a strategic advisor to the British Tony Blair Institute, unquote, which apparently pays extremely well. Now, of course, such income is nothing compared to the billionaire capitalists. They might get a salary, but they get way more from just owning stuff, from just investments. So, of course, it's nothing compared to those people, but it still demonstrates that even these social democrat politicians who act like, they're part of the common people and whatnot, the Finnish media is very good at trying to humanize and make these politicians seem like they're very regular people. Even all the kind of dumb things they do are used as propaganda to make them seem more approachable, more like regular people. But these politicians, they're clearly members of the capitalist class, not members of the working class, because they earn these preposterously inflated wages, which is actually funds that are taken from the exploitation of regular working people and then it's transferred to them. There is no way that their contribution in whatever scam of a job they have, that's actually worth $500,000. Maybe they think that they're that valuable. Maybe the capitalists also think that, oh yeah, I'm so valuable, like I do this, I earn a couple million. But that's just delusion. At least in the short term, the trend seems to be that the politicians are getting richer because another ex-prime minister, Katainen from the right-wing coalition party, they earned more than $300,000 annually working as a public relations man for the Nordea Bank. And another ex-prime minister way back in the day, Aho, from the Center Party, they earned not quite as much working as a consultant. It's been kind of a running joke that retiring from politics, they always give you like a very cushy job, and it's totally true. Even retiring from politics pays really well. If you do what the bourgeoisie tells you to do, they put you in some very cushy job. And at the same time, the regular people, they're getting poorer, their services are being cut, wages are not going up to a sufficient degree to counteract inflation and the rise in prices, and more wealth is being transferred to the capitalists and the corporations.